Hi everyone, this is Andrew Prima, a Ukrainian American reporting from Ukraine. In today's podcast, 35th week of war in Ukraine, and this is the first week of November 2022. Today I would like to talk about the events in Ukraine in the last week, blackouts across Ukraine, battle for the Luhansk region, and the current situation in Kherson. Again, during the week, after numerous Russian-Iranian drone attacks at infrastructure facilities left millions of people without electricity and water. The latest attacks caused blackouts across Ukraine, leaving the hospitals without running water and electricity. Medical facilities across Ukraine have been setting up generators to cope with the routine Russian bombardment that has been degrading the country's power grid. But when Russia targeted Ukraine's electrical facilities on Monday, it interrupted another essential utility, water. So for the first time since the start of Russian invasion in February, four of the Ukrainian capital's biggest hospitals were left without running water for most of the day. The Kyiv Regional Clinical Center was among the facilities impacted. Doctors and nurses scrambled to transfer the most urgent cases to functioning hospitals. Surgeries were cancelled and life-saving treatments like dialysis were postponed, leaving lives in the balance. Russian forces have pounded Ukraine's critical infrastructure for weeks, severely damaging its electrical grid and forcing many towns and cities across the country to impose scheduled hour-long blackouts. Hospitals had so far uh, spared because they rely on backup generator power during outages. But Monday's attacks were so severe the city's water pump stopped working, leaving 1,500 patients across the city in limbo. The hospital had over 50 surgeries scheduled that day, but with staff unable to clean their surgical tools without running water, had no choice but not operate that day. It's clear that Russia wants to deprive us of critical components of social life. If our people are not killed by bombs, they might be deprived of water, electricity, and medical care. However, after repairs, Kyiv's water system was back to functional, but the hospital staff already preparing evacuation plans for the next time that Russia strikes. Ukrainian troops. Let's talk about the Luhansk situation because Ukrainian forces keep offensive campaigns and Russian forces had haven't had any luck so far. So Ukrainian forces are pushing towards an important highway as they make gradual territorial advances in the Luhansk region, one of four areas illegally occupied by Russia in September. The Ukrainian advance advance focuses on a road running south from the Russian border to the part of Luhansk region captured by Russian forces early in the summer. Ukrainian officials say that the road is already under their control, meaning that Russian military traffic uses it at high risk. Senior Ukrainian military official of Luhansk region Serhiy Haidai confirmed that recently liberated villages in the area were being shelled constantly. Ukrainian officials say another obstacle is extensive money by Russian forces. Haidai said that on Monday that the Russians didn't have some plans for a counteroffensive, but these plans were ruined because these plans were ruined by Ukrainian offensive actions. So most probably we won't see any attacks from Russian side. Denis Pushilin, head of the self-declared Donetsk People's Republic, said later on Tuesday that the situation along the Donetsk and Luhansk border remains one of the toughest one. Another target of Ukrainian forces is the city of Kremina in Luhansk. Social media videos and comments by Russian military bloggers indicate that Ukrainians have pushed forward north of the city, complicating efforts to defend it. Kremina and other settlements in the area suffered widespread destruction in the spring as Russian forces and their allies pushed westwards. On Wednesday, the Ukrainian General Staff said that Russian forces continued to launch artillery strikes and mortars against several recently liberated settlements close to the north-south highway. While Ukrainian forces are slowly pushing forward in the area, analysts don't expect any rapid breakthroughs given the scale of artillery and other indirect fire from Russian defensive lines, which were enforced after Russian forces were routed from much of neighboring Kharkiv in September. So, the next very important region to talk about is Kherson. What is happening in Kherson this week? The Russian army is strengthening the defense of the Kherson bridgehead and has concentrated almost all Russian airborne troops here. At the same time, the Russians are evacuating all occupation facilities, have destroyed communications, and preparing to escape from Kherson and leave the city on the left bank of the Dnipro River. As you know, Kherson is divided by Dnipro River. So, and currently, Russian forces are being defeated on the right bank of the river. The Kherson bridgehead is defended by the most capable forces of the Russian army. Almost all of the Russian airborne forces are concentrated there, 3 out of 4 divisions and all 4 brigades. Replenishment of personnel and military equipment is constantly transferred here. A series of Russian defeats in Ukraine has changed the plans of the Russian armed forces lately. Instead of capturing all of Ukraine, the Russians are now forced to focus on holding and capturing Donbas region, on the defense of the land corridor to Crimea through the Zaporizhia region. But the command of the armed forces of Ukraine began its offensive at the advantageous bridgehead in Kherson turned into an anvil. Systematic strikes on bridge over the Dnipro narrowed the possibilities of supplying ammunition and support, and limited the maneuverability of troops, which increased the effectiveness of reconnaissance and attack by high-precision weapons of the armed forces of Ukraine. The Russian armed forces cannot suppress Ukrainian artillery and missile systems. Defense is possible, but in such conditions, the Russians will suffer unacceptable losses. Now, the commander of the Russian armed forces in Ukraine, Surovkin, is forced under the pressure of the Ukrainian army to plan to surrender Kherson, because he sees the inability of his elite troops to seize the initiative in the battle for Kherson. In order to avoid defeat, the Russians plan to deploy a shortened line of defense along the Dnipro River, because Kherson has become a trap hundreds of times bigger than Zmeiny Island, which absorbs reserves and prevents the Russian army from solving at least the task in Zaporizhia and Donbas regions. Currently, Russian troops have built a defense that is not dense, but is deeply echelon defense deployed along the landings based on the maneuver of artillery and aviation fire, the use of tactical reserves with armored vehicles. The goal of the Russians is to prevent quick incursions and entrenchments of small Ukrainian combat groups. Landings in the Kherson region are rare, well visible. The intervals between them are large, 1.22 kilometers. The first line of defense is the forward landing, dealing with small, unarmored infantry forces that perform reconnaissance and surveillance functions. This line is mined both before and after landing. The main forces are concentrated on the second and third landing lines. Intelligence, equipments, drones, tactical reserves, tanks and armored vehicles, and many anti-tank missile systems for which these are optimal conditions of use are concentrated there. Also, significant forces of Russian artillery and air defense equipment are also there. The Russians do not hold the front edge. Therefore, an attack by small groups on a narrow front, the task of carrying out a raid without coordination and interaction with artillery, and the calculation of advancing into the gaps in the battle formations can lead to the stopping of the attack in the second, maximum third landing, pulling up tactical reserves, tanks, to the place of the breakthrough, shelling with artillery. Attacks by small groups in separate areas and infiltration by infantry in these directions are ineffective. Offensive actions are effective when the enemy suffers significant losses, command posts, support artillery, and armored vehicles are destroyed, and the attack must be preceded by the softening of the defense over a large area. Otherwise, the attack requires completely different number and qualities of strike groups. So, will the Russians flee themselves? The Russian combat the Russian command is doing everything possible to hold Kherson for as long as possible. However, if the powerful pressure of the armed forces of Ukraine continues or even increases due to more effective planning of offensive operation, then the Russian command will begin to retreat. So, the surrender of Kherson will mean Putin's inability to seize the initiative in the war even after full-scale mobilization. This will be a huge strategic defeat for Russia and Ukraine's ability to defeat any powerful Russian group. But the battle is not over yet. The enemy is trying with all his might to delay and, at the slightest chance to avoid defeat, the Ukrainian army will put an end to the battle and the liberation of Kherson, sooner or later. So, with all this defeat, what is happening in the Russian military leadership? The recent trend of resignation in the Russian military leadership might indicate that the Kremlin is going to shift the blame for its failures and miscalculations in the war against Ukraine to the generals. It recalls that on November 3rd, instead of dismissed Colonel General Alexander Lapin, Major General Alexander Linkov was apparently appointed as the commander of the Central Military District and, if confirmed, is another example of the replacement of Russian commanders due to failures at the front lines. Intelligence reminds that before that, Lapin was publicly criticized by the leaders of Chechnya, Ramzan Kadyrov, who is the closest ally of Putin, and the head of Wagner's group, Yevgeny Prigozhin, who is one of the closest friends of Putin. These resignations indicate a tendency to blame the higher command of the Russian army for failures to achieve goals on the battlefield. In part, this looks like an attempt to remove this guilt from the top leadership of Russian Federation in the eyes of domestic audience. For Russian leaders, first of all, Putin himself, Kherson is the only occupied regional center after February 24, as well as the left bank of Kherson region, which has already been declared Russian territory, is of a great political importance. Putin understands very well that the loss of this part of the occupied territory will deal another devastating blow to his image, which has already shaken quite a lot after previous gestures of goodwill, as we say. Therefore, it is clear that he is putting pressure on the military command. And the military command perfectly understands that. They cannot contradict Putin. They feel though difficult it will be they feel how difficult it will be for them to hold this bridgehead on the right bank of the Dnipro River. The springboard for the Russian operation is of strategic importance. From there, it is possible to develop a further offensive in the direction of Odessa and Transnistria. If we move away from this bridgehead now, the chances of returning there again, even if forces are accumulated, are particularly equal to zero. On the other hand, trying to keep this bridgehead because of the problems with supply, the unreliability of logistics chains carries a threat. At this moment, all this Russian defense on the right bank may collapse, and now the Russian command has to make a choice whether to withdraw the troops from there in a controlled way, while there is such opportunity, or try to hold this bridgehead and receive a strategic defeat when the troops will be either defeated or surrounded and captured. What the Russians actually can count on? They continue to count on the whole set of tools they are using, from nuclear blackmail to energy weapons to food weapons, as you remember the grain deal that they tried to damage. This poor attempt at the grain blackmail has already failed. There were provocations with a dirty bomb as well. Using all your leverage at the level of international organizations, nothing actually worked. But they stubbornly tried to use all this, including what the civilian population suffers from, particularly through Ukraine, strikes on energy infrastructure facilities. Another argument is the hope that the new advanced weapons can turn the tide of the conflict. There is already successful experience with these Iranian drones. They continue to cause harm to Ukraine. There was a short shock effect until Ukrainians learned how to destroy them. Unfortunately, if Iran supplies ballistic missiles, it will also be an extremely difficult period for Ukraine when the Russians start using them, because Ukraine doesn't have defense systems for such advanced rockets and new drone types that Iran promised to deliver. But again, it's not a weapon that can turn the tide of the war. And even when there are discussions about the possibility of using tactical nuclear weapons, there is an understanding that the threat of using such weapons has a greater effect than the very fact of use of them. Glory to Ukraine and Ukrainians who defend our territory. Thank you for listening to my podcast. Please listen to our other podcasts and share with your friends. Thank you.